So the first step is to choose your leveling height. So that may seem kind of self-explanatory, but the first thing to consider is, do you have any fixed points? So for example, behind me, there is a beautiful old fireplace that we wanted to save. And so we picked the solid point off of the fireplace and then leveled the house to that. So that's one. Now, normally what you're gonna do is you're just gonna level the house to the highest point. So that's the other consideration. So you find the highest point with your laser level and then level the house to that highest point. And then lastly would be, if you're dealing with an old house that's on a slope or maybe built too close to the ground, is raising it up so that you get the house away from ground contact. Hey there. So this video is a step-by-step process of how to level an old post and pier house. The one that we're leveling is 100 years old, so any old house this should work for. And I'll put timestamps in all the different sections. So if you don't need that particular section for your project, just skip to the next chapter. We'll go over beams, joists, posts, jacking, leveling, basically everything you need to know from beginning to end to level your house, or to level a portion of your house, or to level a deck, whatever project you're working on that's got a leveling component to it. There'll be something in this video for you. So without further ado, back to the video. Okay, so step number 2 is marking your reference line. So the first thing that you need to do when you're going to mark your reference line is you have to choose a laser level. In this project that I'm on right here, I started with a 3-point laser level that just shoots 1 point. There's also the line style and then the 360 style. And then I moved to the 360 style. Actually, luckily enough, DOVOH laser levels, they contacted me and asked me to review their product. So I got that laser level in the middle of this project, and it really made this project a lot easier. They're not sponsoring this video, but they did give me a laser level in the process of this video. So once you've chosen your laser level, the next thing to do is to choose a reference line height. So basically all you need to do, so if you're doing a big section like a whole house like I'm doing here, I would recommend getting a 360 laser level. I did really like the DOVOH, but just choose a height that's a little bit lower than your beams, but as close to the joists as possible, with, you know, hopefully there's no pipes and stuff in the way, just at the highest point with no obstructions. And then I like to choose an even number. So from the bottom of the joists to the laser level line, I'd like to choose a number like 10 or 15 or 20 so that it's easy to remember and easy to check when I go around and check my levels around the house. So then the next thing to do is to mark that reference line. So after you set up your laser level, and I just set up, I started with my PLS, but then I moved on my PLS 3-point. And then I moved on to the DOVOH 360 and just put it on any old camera tripod. Set it on the tripod, make your marks, and just mark all the way around the house at that line so you know what your reference line is. And then start lifting the house. Okay, so now we're going to go on to lifting the house. So step 3 is to set up a temporary beam. Now you don't need to set up a temporary beam if you're not replacing any beams. But if you are replacing beams, so go forward past the temporary beam part if you're not replacing beams, and go straight to the jacking part. So to set up a temporary beam, the first thing to do is to choose a beam that's just slightly bigger than the beam that you're using. You know, there are calculation tables online which you can use for spans that will show you what size beam to use. You know, some people get super into all the numbers about how to do it. I basically go kind of with common sense. You know, if I'm looking at, so this house had a 4x6 that it was the perimeter beam, and they were 8 foot apart, and the beams were sagging in between those 8-footers. So I know that that's insufficient. So with my temporary beam, I found an old 4x8, and we used that 4x8 to lift about a 12-foot section of the house, and we did it 12-foot section at a time. Actually it was a 4x12, it wasn't a 4x8, it was 4x12. So just go with a larger size beam, or use a shorter distance between your jacks when you're selecting your temporary beam. You know, another thing that you could do, which I did on a project with I had a crazy client who was rebuilding a mobile home, and he wanted to open the whole thing up, and we took like 24-inch wide strips of plywood and then glued them 8-foot long pieces at 4-foot staggered sections, and glued them all together with a ton of PL polyurethane adhesive, and smashed them together real good with clamps, and then made our own like DIY glue lamp beam and ran that thing, I think 30 feet across the beam ridge of the mobile home. So you can get creative to make whatever type of beam support that you want for your temporary beam. So lifting the beam into place. So we came up with kind of a creative solution to lifting the beam into place. What we did was we put 2 large lag bolts, pre-drilled holes, stuck them into the existing joist, screwed them into the existing joist so they're slightly tilted up, took a ratchet strap and then wrapped it around, and then just by hand pushed it up and pulled that ratchet strap until it was pretty high, and then locked on the ratchets. An important note is when you're cutting holes in a joist, you can do 1/3, technically you can do 1/3 of the joist and not ruin the structural integrity. So doing little holes like that is not going to mess up the structural integrity of the joist. So we put a ratchet strap on each end on those bolts and then just strapped it up. We did have to, when it was, I think in one section it was heavy, and we put an extra ratchet strap on there so that we could release one and then ratchet strap up one side. A lot of times when you're dealing with these kind of beams and this sizes that I'm talking about, you can just hand lift it, and if you have 2 guys with you, and then readjust the ratchet strap and then strap it up again, and then suck that beam all the way up to the joists. Now, if you don't want to do the ratchet strap technique, you can do the cribbing thing where they crib, 2, 4, 6, 8 pieces of wood and just keep stacking them up if you have lots of access to wood like that. I'm sure you've seen houses that have been lifted with that cribbing technique of boards just under the corners and under beams. Okay, so now you've got your beam up. The next thing to do is to put the posts, to get the posts in place. The first thing you need to do to get the posts in place is to pick the location. And so I did use the 360 laser level to do the level of the house, but I really like the 3-point laser level for picking my points underneath the beams. This is a mistake I find that so many people make, is they think since it's a hole or since it's on the ground, you don't have to pay as much attention, you can just start digging or whatever. Just use a laser level. And I'd love to be able to say you could just use a regular level, but it is so much harder. So, laser levels, if you're taking the time and energy to raise a house, if it were me and I was raising a deck or a house, and if it was of a decent size, I would buy both a 360 and a 3-point to do the job. So I take my 3-point laser level and I put the 3-point laser level on the ground until it points right to the middle top of the beam. And once I got it right on the middle top of the beam, I make a little mark on the ground, and then I make a flat spot. So we're on a slope, so we had to create flat spots on underneath that spot, about 12 by 12 or 14 by 12. So you use a 2 by 12 material if you got it, something like that as the base of your jack. So then what I like to do is take the back of a hammer and then claw it out and make all the soil soft and as level as I can. So I'm using a small bullet level to just kind of check the soil side to side, back and forth, until I got it sort of roughly as level as I think I've got it. And I've got the soil loose. And now that the soil's loose and I've got the laser level, not the laser level, now that the soil's loose and it's roughly level, then I put my block, my 12 by 12 block. So I've got that 12 by 12 block sitting on my soft soil, and now I'm pounding it down with a mallet all the way around, trying to get it perfectly level. And it's really important that it's compressed evenly.
So I compress it evenly, pound it down, and I check it with my bullet level, 45s, different angles, all the way around. Once I got it perfectly level, then I set my jack on it.
So I just wanted to say here that at this point, if you wanted to purchase the jacks, the house leveling jacks that are the type that you ratchet them around and try to level the house, lift and level the house this way, they're pretty expensive for the really sturdy ones, but you can do that instead of the system that I'm about to tell you how to use posts and put bottle jacks underneath it. If you got a bottle jack and that's what you want to use, then this system will work. And if you want to purchase the other ones, that'll work too. You still have to be very careful about getting either the jacks that you purchase or the system that I'm going to describe now really, really plumb.
Now with my jack set on it, I use my laser level again, and I point that laser level straight up to the middle of the beam and make sure that it's set perfectly on the beam. Once I got those two things done, then I'll stick my bullet level. It's nice to have one that has a magnet onto the side of the bottle jack. So once that's plumb and then the flat part is level and I've got the laser line that's pointing up to the center of the beam, then the next thing that I do is measure the distance from the beam to the bottle jack. And I cut a temporary beam. It can be a 4x4 or 4x6, whatever you're dealing with. Usually a 4x4 is sufficient for, it depends on how much weight you're lifting, but usually a 4x4 is sufficient. So once you get that once you get that measured, cut it, you stick it in there, you're putting it in place, and before you put it in place, you put like a 2x8 or something like that. It doesn't really matter that it's too wide, by like 16 inches, and you screw it off on the beam, and then you push your post into place. Make sure you got it right in that spot, right in the center of your laser line point. Put it into place, and then screw it in to your scab of your 2x material that you put on the side of the beam onto the post. So now I've got a beam that's coming down and the post base. It's really critical. It's really good to have a partner. If I back up a second, when you're screwing that post on, if you just set one screw, then you can level it side to side and get that perfect plumb, excuse me. You can make it plumb side to side. You get that perfectly plumb, and then you screw it off, and then you set another screw or two screws. Now it's going down and it's perfectly plumb in one direction. Now you have to work with the other direction, the front to back direction. So you might have to adjust it a little bit this way or a little bit that way. And if it's too weird, or if you got the base wrong, then you might have to readjust it. You might have to move your footing and start all over with your footing jack again. That happens. You just have to accept that. Don't try to cheat and not have it perfectly level. It is really critical that when you're jacking up a house, especially when you're going long distances, like some of these posts that we jacked up were, 8 feet or 6 feet or 4 feet. When you have these longer sections, you really got to get it perfectly plumb and right underneath the beam. If it's a little shorter, it may not need to be perfectly under the beam, but it still has to be really plumb or the jack will start to tilt out. And that obviously can get dangerous. So now you have your post attached, your jack and your footing underneath it. The next thing I do is I slide a piece of metal between the bottle jack and the post. It's also very important that when you measure it, that bottle jack is fully depressed, because you want to be able to extend that bottle jack as far up as you can. Then if there's a little bit, so I'll measure that post probably a 1/2 inch shorter than the bottle jack. And then I'll stick in the piece of metal. An old shovel works fine, anything like that. And then I'll usually slide up, usually those bottle jacks have the little twisty piece, and I'll twist up the metal till it snugs with the bottle jack, and then start jacking. And you'll start jacking, and so inevitably some of your jacks are going to twist one way or another because you didn't get the soil just right. And then usually you can tap it back and forth, like tap it to get it to adjust a little bit. You got a little bit of wiggle room there to go back to level. So if it's going like this, you want to try to get this back, and then you'll have to move that over. When I say this, you'll have to move the post back, and then you're going to want to move the bottle jack over a little bit the other way and try to push it back. So you're kind of splitting the difference. So if you're going like this, then you're going to try to set it like that a little bit, and then hopefully it'll push back to center. So just keep watching your plumb and then adjusting back and forth until you get it to where it's nice and plumb. One of the things I think that's really important for safety is, like, don't tear everything apart. Just do one post at a time. So don't start tearing apart the walls, tearing apart the floors. tearing apart all the beams and trying to jack it up at the same time. Just jack the whole thing up and then tear apart the minimum that you need to tear apart and then build it back up. So because buildings hold themselves together in weird ways. I've seen buildings where the footings have completely knocked out and the siding and the joists or everything are what's holding up the house. So don't start taking everything apart before you jack everything up. I did make a separate video about positioning the jacks under the posts. So I'll put that in the show notes in the description and hopefully link it here. So now you've got your jacks, they're just snug to your posts. And you've got, actually I want to back up a second here. So before you jack up your posts, when you're setting up your posts, you've got them all in place. The next thing that you need to do is create a lateral support, 45s in both directions. So you want to take that post and secure it at a 45-degree angle to one of the joists above you. So that way, so you're going to level it side to side until you get it perfectly level, and then you stick a lateral support of any scab piece of material like 2x6 or whatever up to a joist in the floor. And then you're going to do it lateral, you're going to plummet the other way to the beam and give it a lateral support in that angle. So once those two angles are set, then you put the post underneath it and start jacking it up. So these 45 lateral supports, when you attach to the joist, it's actually kind of a good thing to consider when you're setting your temporary post base, to think about where the joist is when you choose the location of your temporary jack for your temporary jack base for the temporary beam. So if you set it so that you're going to be able to put your lateral support almost in a vertical plane with the post, that's going to be the best place to put it. Now, if you can't, it doesn't really matter, because you can, those lateral supports can be at angles. It's not really that important. And the screws that you're using, you know, some solid GRKs are going to work fine. You know, 4-inch GRKs are basically what I would use. Maybe 3 of those, 3 on the joists and 3 on the post in each direction. You know, 3 on the beam, 3 on the post, 3 on the joist, 3 on the post. So now you're going to jack up the beam. So you're jacking up the beam, and as you're jacking, you know, quadruple check your plumb lines. You want to make sure that those plumb lines are good during the whole jacking process. And then always watch the point at which the jack hits the piece of wood, because it'll pivot in the, you know, it'll start to lean if it's not really nice and plumb. And if it isn't plumb, then just back off, reset the jack, move it a little bit the other way, and start over. That's kind of the most important safety tip, is while you're jacking, watch the plumb line of the jack, and then reset if you need to. So another question that might come up is, what sequence should you do your leveling in? And I really think it's context dependent. So in this case, the perimeter of this whole building wasn't properly sealed from the moisture. Like, the siding ended right before the end of where all this structural stuff was holding up the building. So it was completely rotted on the outside. And the outsides of the building was starting to like fade down into the ground. But the middle was pretty good and pretty close to level. So we started this project by going all the way around the perimeter and then worked our way back to the middle. But if in your case, your middle foundation is starting to sag, maybe you would start in the middle and work to the perimeter. So I think the rule of thumb would be, start with where it's the most out, and then work from your high point on those spots that are the most sagging back to the least sagging. So then it's pretty simple from that point on. You're just jacking side to side until that temporary beam goes up. And then now you start checking from your reference point. And so let's say 10 inches is your reference point that you've chosen. Then you're going to go 10 inches and you're going to try to make that, obviously, every joist. So I would use the bottom of the joists as long as all your joists are the same thickness. So use your reference point off the bottom of the joist And then as you're jacking up the beam, just get everywhere along that beam so that you get, if your reference point is 10 inches, every joist measures 10 inches when you've jacked it up to the proper height. If you have rotten beams, this is the time, actually no, if you have rotten joists, this is the time to replace rotten joists. So what we did in this case was we took joists, so we had a 10-foot span between our existing beams. So we took 10-foot beam, 10-foot joists, they were 2x8s, and then put them up into the cavity. Now when you put them up in the cavity, they're only gonna sit at an angle. You can't get them all the way in. So what we did is just took a sledgehammer and then hammered one end in all the way down, sort of like, and then just, you know, snuck it in. Now, if it's absolutely too tight to do that in your particular case, then you can set up another temporary beam in the same way, where you have the post, not a beam, you have a temporary post, and instead of setting a beam underneath the joists, just do a long like 4x6 or 4x8 or something, and stick it underneath the joists themselves on the opposite side of the joist where you want to put in your new sister joist, and then jack it up from underneath until you get like a 1/4 inch, and then slam in your joist with your sledgehammer. And then you use ring shank or screws. I like to use screws and nails, a couple of screws just to hold it in place, and then nails across the sister joist. Now, if that sister joist goes from beam to beam, it's not really critical whether those nails are super close or not. So always try to go the full length with your sister joist when you're sistering up to rotten joists. But if you can't and you have to do a shorter length, I would really recommend that you don't go any shorter than like 4 feet, if at all possible, and try to get the longest length that you can. And when you get that long length, it's critical that you really make a patch of nails at the far end away from the rotten point, because it's going to want to pivot, it's going to want to push that side down. So I would do like 10 nails, ring shank nails, on the far end away from the rotten end of the joist. And don't put those nails too close to each other. Like put them 2 inches apart, or 1.5 inches. 1.5 inches apart is good. And just make a big block of nails. And that, when you're nailing them in, you try to stay off of the grain. So you try not to make a nail line on the grain, because that'll split the wood. So you try to put your nails on different parts of the grain so they won't split. And then when that force tries to push the house, it'll try to push your sister off, it'll hit that block that you've created. And then do like a 45-degree pattern of nails every 8 inches or so across the beam going back to the rotten part. Another thing that's kind of important if you're dealing with an older house, so this house is 100 years old, and they used full dimensional lumber when they built this house. So, you know, when you're getting 2x8s, if you've got, you know, one of this old house, that 2x8 may be actually full 2 inches by 8 inches, whereas you go to the lumber yard, it's going to be 1.5 inches by 7.5 inches. So if that's the case, you can either rip down 2x10s, or you can shim up the 2x8s. And I think either one is going to be fine, as long as you're securing everything properly together. So now it's time to remove and replace your rotten beam, if that's what you're doing. In this case, when we removed our beams, we pulled them out at that point. We've got our new sisters in place, and then we had our rotten old joists sticking out. I personally don't remove rotten joists if I can wire brush them down to hardwood. So I'll wire brush them down to hardwood and then put copper green on them, and then I'll leave them. Sometimes I'll come back and cut them, or you can't cut them back or copper green them, I guess would be my recommendation. So we were only dealing with our new beams. We were dealing with 4x6. So we took 4x6s that were 8 foot apart posts and made them 4x6s with 4 foot apart posts. So the span was short enough to support the house. So if you're using a bigger beam or a longer distance and it's really heavy, then you may need to use the cribbing to put your new beam in place. What we did was we actually pushed the beam up. We had a couple of guys who pushed it up, and then just toe screwed it in to the new joists that we had, and that held it in place. And then we built temporary beam supports up underneath it. So put posts underneath it, and then jack it, set the jacks just like I explained in the last section underneath those temporary jacks, and then jacked it up until we were sure that the temporary posts and the new beam were at the same height. Once we had that set and knew that that was exactly where it needed to be, then we started to dig the new holes. It's really important before you set the temporary post in a location that's not going to interfere with your permanent post placement. Okay, so the next step is to dig the concrete pier holes. So one of the critical things that I notice that most people don't do is to really be precise when you dig your holes. So you can kind of barely see behind me, there's 2 holes there, 2 concrete piers. And what we did was we took the sonotube and cut the holes. So the sonotube, we used 12-inch wide sonotubes in diameter, and we cut the holes at about 10 inches. And sometimes what I like to do, if I can, is to try to make like an elephant foot. And that way, you know, you think of an elephant foot, it's really stable. So I'll cut down with the digging bar and the post hole digger or the auger. And then with the digging bar, I'll ream out around the bottom so it opens up like that foot. Now, sometimes that's going to be very difficult in soils. And so I do it when I can. The other thing about digging the hole is you want to go, it depends on your soil type, but generally 24 inches down is good. If you're in a frost zone, you'll have to go below the frost zone, and that's going to vary by area. So you don't have frost lift. Where I am on the West Coast, we don't have to worry about that. But the critical thing, the point that I want to make is that I use a laser level and I put that laser level in the bottom of the hole as I'm digging it, and then go straight up to the center of the beam line. And while I'm digging that hole, I'll keep checking it. You know, so often you start digging a hole and then like there's something in the way and it kind of drips from one side to the other, and then you go and then you pour your hole, you put your footing in, and then it's like it's twisted and it's off. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me, and I've seen it happen. I'm sure you've seen like post bases with holes and they're like just barely on the edge of it. And when you're pouring a concrete footing, you need at least 2 inches on the side. And I really like to have my post bases right in the middle of my concrete piers. So use the laser level and use a point laser level to go straight up and give you that point up there. The other thing that I like to do is I like to just use the sonotubes to raise above the soil, because you don't want that layer of cardboard down in the ground, because it just creates a little layer that's going to destabilize the concrete a little bit. So you know, you have a 12-inch sonotube and then cut your hole at 10 inches so that the sonotube will just easily sit right on top. If you don't do that, then it becomes a problem and you have to like put a piece of wood on them. You can do that. Sometimes what I've done is just put pieces of wood like this, and that'll hold the sonotube in place. But it's easier if you just cut that hole a little bit smaller at the top. So do as I say and not as I do. These post bases should have been 8 inches above ground level. Yeah, so that's a mistake that we made on this build. It'll be fine. This will last a super long time, but it definitely was a mistake. I don't want you to imitate that. So the next thing to do is to build your posts down to your holes. So the first thing that we did is we would set the sonotube right here on the ground on top of our hole, and then we'd get it as level as possible with a bullet level. And then what we did was measure from here up to the beam, and then we'd add 5/8 of an inch. So a 1/2 inch so that it goes up a 1/2 inch, and then another 1/8 of an inch just for this metal plate here. If you have the type of post base that has a standoff, you'll have to include the thickness of the standoff in your measurement and then subtract that from the post. So then we measured out the post's length, you know, minus a 1/2 inch, and then we just toe screwed it in and then put the scab piece of 2x12 or 2x8 material here, and then screwed in here and screwed in here. Now that this is free floating, it's standing, it's right here free floating, just held in place, and we level it side to side and back and forth until we got it perfectly, level it, I mean plumb, until we got it perfectly plumb. And then we take this post base, push it up to it. Actually, let me back up a little bit. We actually put the post base on first before we attach the post. We put the post base on and attach the post, and then we come back and put in the concrete. So when we put in the concrete, we just pour it in sort of carefully all around the sides, and we have this staked off. So this is staked off so that it's not going to move. We put the concrete in and then really jam down all of the air pockets with a piece of rebar. When we attach this, when we get it plumb side to side, we take a piece of 2x6 or any type of scrap and go from the beam down to the post, and that'll lock it in place this way, and then we just drive a stake in that way at the front to back plane. So then the last thing to do is to pour the concrete footing. You know, I mean, most of you are probably familiar with pouring concrete. I really like it at a pancake batter consistency. And what I really also try to do is to keep it a little bit thicker when I'm pouring the very top of the hole. And then I like to round the top. I try to shape it down so that when water hits this, it sheds away. So it doesn't pool back into the wood. It sheds down the side of the pier block. So the next thing to do is the next step is to add a shear, something to make it so that the house doesn't, you know, slide one direction or the other during an earthquake or just as it settles. These are actually insufficient. So what I would do instead of these would be like a 4x6 or a 4x8, or twisted in the other direction so that they go, I like to have them cut inside like this. It just looks nicer. And I actually think it's more structural. So these were just for aesthetics, but if you pivot it on the side and then you put in a 2x6 or a 2x8, and then you lock it in here, then the building can't twist. If you put it on the surface with bolts or screws, those bolts or screws can crack and rip out the wood. So that's a little bit less structurally sound. And then the last way you can do it is put any type of shear panel material, any type of plywood on the outside and screw it really good. And you don't even have to do every section. You could do like one section and then a section on the end. You know, there's structural span tables that will tell you what's sufficient. I kind of go with common sense. A 2x6 on end, every one of these would work. I would guess probably every other or every third 4x8 panel would work as well. Or if you wanted to just sheed the whole thing, then it would be bomber and never go anywhere. So let's say that you found that was some sort of error in your initial leveling. It's not the end of the world. What you can do is you can fix it from the top is where I would fix it. So in this beam, we found that there was an error in the initial leveling. And so it was, these are 1/2-inch shims. It was basically a 1-inch error. And so what we did was we took 2 pieces of 1/2-inch pressure treated plywood and then just slathered them with PL construction adhesive and then really hammered them in with a hammer so that they're completely stuck in there. And then on the inside, we added the T-strap. So this is how we fix that. And that's gonna last for a long, long time, especially when we cover this whole thing in waterproof sheathing like we're going to do, which is the initial error, which the previous homeowners did not do. This old rotten siding, it ended here when it should have ended down here. So in a lot of old houses, you're gonna find that your support members, your beams are just laying right on the ground in certain parts. So on the uphill side of this house, we had a beam that was laying right on the ground, pretty much completely rotted out. And so it's difficult a lot of times to get up underneath those. So what we did in this case was we pulled out the old beam and it luckily had this little bit of foundation that was already underneath there, and then another beam from the center of the house that ran all the way up to here. But in this one, what we had to do was basically rip it out, and then we had to take, so we built the beam on the corner of the house first, and then we built then this center beam second, and then we ripped this one out, and then we had to use like a pry bar. Actually, we just used a pry bar to pry it up and then slide this new beam in. And we did the same thing where we put the beam and set it in place, and then we backfilled these are 3/4 inch, or yeah, the 3/4 and a half inch pressure treated plywood shim underneath it. And then we did the same thing where we backfilled we put the post hanger right up against the beam and then backfilled the concrete to it. So it's not perfect, but you know, when you're dealing with old houses that are built in a funky way and you're on a budget and you're not trying to rebuild the whole house from the ground up, you kind of have to make compromises to try to figure out what is going to be the structurally most sound, longest lasting way that I can fix this without tearing the whole thing down. So that was the solution we came up with here. So when it comes to the post bases, this is basically the style that we used for most of these post bases, mainly because they were available. And then this is one that you'll find at Home Depot and Lowe's and all those other ones. And I really don't like these kind. You see how little of the cement is actually held by the post base? So that's why I really go for these instead. The only thing that I would like is and I think they're out there, I just haven't been able to get them locally, is this style with this top. Because then when you have that metal on top of there, you got that inch or 3/4 of an inch that keeps the metal off of the concrete for extra moisture protection. Also, this kind is super solid, but I think it's a little bit overkill. So if you come over here, these ones are a lot quicker to install. You just put in some bolts or you could put in some nails, and that's more than secure enough, I think, for the long run. I mean, technically, this bad boy right here is going to last a lot longer. So it's 6 one, half dozen the other. These ones take longer because you got to really drill that big hole through and then add all these bolts, and it's more expensive to buy the bolts. These ones are going to be quicker to install, and I think in most cases they're more than enough. But definitely use the long U type that really get into the concrete so that it's not going to just have this little tiny piece of concrete on top, which could just crack off. So the last thing I wanted to do is talk to you guys a little bit about the DOVOH. It really made this project so much easier. I can't tell you how hard it was to try to do it with my pointer laser. Once I got this guy and had the 360 view, it really made it so much easier. DOVOH sent this to me, full disclosure. They said I could keep it. They didn't ask me for a good review, but obviously I might be compelled to give them a good review because they gave me the unit. But I honestly can say that I am really impressed with the unit. It does have really bright light. I tested it against my PLS, like I shot my PLS along the line of this DOVOH, and it was within the exact same accuracy as the PLS, and they're the top of the line around here. The other thing about the DOVOHs, they give you a 5-year warranty, which is pretty solid in the world of laser levels. Another thing for me, I have so many tools and I have so much stuff, so I really appreciate a good case. So these guys, it's a good case and all the stuff is in there, and the battery life, straight up easy USB is really good. I've burned out 2 batteries already. When I say burned out, I mean I've used them up, and they last a long, long time. To be honest with you, I don't really use the accessories much. That's just not the way I build. It seems a little cumbersome for me. But for those of you that would want to use some of the other accessories, like the clamp, that'll be great. I think just a little tripod is the way to go. So I'll leave links to this particular unit, their Amazon link, in the show description. Leave comments, leave questions in the comment section, or your own ideas on how to level a house. I've really gotten a lot of value out of some of the comments that people leave, and I'm learning all the time. So whenever I see a comment that really challenges something that I said or adds to something that I said, I really think it through, and it's really valuable. And I would say to you, like, if you're not getting all your answers, all your questions answered here, they may be answered in the comments section. So go in there and check that out, because I don't know everything. There's so, I think that the era that we live in of community engagement and sort of community interaction around ideas and projects just makes it so there's so much more information. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.